Good morning and welcome to Market Outsiders. I'm Jenny Ray LaRue and I'm really excited to be with you today. I am dialing in from Philly and Namaan is somewhere on the outskirts of Austin. Is this true, Namaan?
I'm actually inside the city limits, but yeah, I'm in Southeast Austin, so I think a lot of people here would consider this to be the outskirts.
I love it. Well, good morning. Excited to be with you. It's raining here. I don't even know what that stuff is coming from the sky, coming from California in the summer. So it's kind of delightful to be in Philadelphia today. I'm curious, what piqued your interest in what's happening in the business news world today?
So I was inspired by some of the conversations we've had over the last couple of weeks, and I went and did some digging just around the number of privately held companies in America versus the number of publicly traded companies. And what I found confirmed our hypothesis, but even I was stunned by just like the delta between how many publicly traded companies there are and how many privately held companies there are. So let me just share a couple of stats with everyone because this is really the premise behind Market Outsiders is that a lot of the most interesting things happening in business and happening in the markets are happening outside of the purview of the public markets. And so in the US, you have under 4,000 publicly traded companies. And if you want to limit that even
Under
further,
4,000?
under 4,000 publicly traded companies. And, if you want to limit that to companies that do at least $100 million in revenue, now you're down to like 1,300 companies that are publicly traded to do 100 million in revenue. So, like, okay, like sizable, but fairly small. Contrast that with privately held companies. In America overall, you have 25 million privately held businesses. Over 60,000 of them are PE or VC backed. So even if you wanted to like ignore the mom and pop businesses and say, okay, let's just think about privately held businesses as businesses that are PE or VC backed, it's 60,000 versus 4,000. And so there's just a lot more activity going on in the private markets. There's a lot more velocity going on in the private markets, and that's really the premise of this podcast: is that we shine a light not just on your S&P 500 or Nasdaq 1,000 companies, but we also talk about what's happening in the rest of the economy. And so I just thought that was interesting. I thought it'd be useful for everybody just to know kind of how the business landscape is structured in the US. Now, if you want to look at companies in terms of value or market cap, yeah, those 1,300 publicly traded companies, right, like they hold their own against right the 25 million other businesses. But just in terms of level of activity and where a lot of kind of the innovation is happening, it's not always in the public markets.
Well, I love that because one of the things that we work to do here is connect the dots. And so today I'm going to talk about a company that you've all heard of. I was shocked not just by what's happening at the company. There were two really funny things I thought that were in this news story that I kind of pulled out in terms of insight, but also I was shocked by the number of employees they have. And I haven't done the digging to figure out what all of these employees are doing. But I'm also really interested in understanding employers. And Naman, we talked about at the rodeo how I discovered a company that I'd never heard of that has hundreds of thousands of employees. Well, this is a company that you've all heard of that has tens of thousands of employees. And so you'll recognize why these companies have an outsized view in the market, but also why they're overrepresented in terms of mind share and understanding. And we have to then take that insight and learn from it when we apply insights to the private markets. So if it's all right with you, Naman, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and talk a little bit about a news story. You ready for this?
Let's do it.
I don't know if you even heard this news or saw this news. Paramount to cut 3% of US workforce as it deepens cost cutting. So, this kind of workforce cut doesn't usually make the news. My first thought was this seems like a little bit of a slow news day. I mean, what is that, like 10 people? Not so. I was kind of shocked about how many people work at Paramount. Right. So Paramount Global told employees that it would be reducing its workforce by 3.5% and that the majority of the impacted staff would be alerted on Tuesday. So this is late breaking news from just a couple of hours ago. It's the latest round of layoffs at the media company. So this is not just new news. This is kind of a continuation of old news. And it also extrapolates to other things that are happening at Disney and Warner Brothers. And I think that's one of the most interesting pieces of this, which is that it's not we often talk about the difference between company specific, sector specific, and then macroeconomic cuts. And so when you see something across a sector, you can take a different insight from it than you could take if it was just isolated to that individual organization. And so one of our first questions that we always ask when we look at Home Depot Day, right, is it Home Depot and Lowe's or Home Depot or Lowe's? And then you see the difference between the operators and their market position and the customers that they serve versus you see the differences between, for example, tariffs or price changes or input supplies. And so, anyhow, going down to this, right? Cutting off it's cutting its U.S. based employees, several hundred employees. So initially, I kind of scrolled down and I was like, how many employees are we talking? They employed 18,600 full and part time employees, which I thought was kind of extraordinary. I was really trying to figure out what all of these employees are doing at Paramount, and I haven't gotten to the bottom of it yet. But that does seem like a very staff heavy business that's concerning in a market with contracting with increasing input costs and also contracting revenue. So this on the surface kind of makes sense to me. It said macroeconomic headwinds, traditional pay TV bundles. I'm not sure if I believe that entirely. That's always one of the kind of key questions. But this was the funniest thing. And I just want to talk a little bit about comms and org design. Paramount has three CEOs. Like, right, the memo, which came from the office of the CEO, George Cheeks, Chris McCarthy, and Brian Robbins. Okay, now, so it's rare to see two CEOs, but I cannot remember a time when I've seen three CEOs. And when you think about where Paramount should cut, my first thought was, why don't they cut one of those guys or maybe two of them? Because how do you make executive decisions by consensus? Like this is what a board is for, but not the office of the CEO. So anyhow, I was kind of struck by the fact that that it appears as though this is actually pretty eloquently stated. The office of the CEO put out this memo and explained that the layoffs would be happening today. But I would imagine that if you're trying to do crisis comms in an organization like Paramount and you're explaining that you're cutting people from an office with three CEOs, that's a really challenging needle to thread. So anyhow, they obviously have the ability to do it, the right to do it, but for me, from a cultural communications perspective, that presents a huge challenge. Namaan, what do you see in this article and insight, and what do you think is kind of fascinating about what's happening at Paramount today?
Well, my first question when I saw the news was which division are the cuts concentrated in? Because Paramount historically has been a fairly diversified media business. They have like their cable offering, they have a streaming offering. I believe they even have a parks business on a much smaller scale than Disney does, but like there's some kind of like in-person entertainment business. I believe there's like a film studio attached to Paramount. So there's like a lot that they do. So I wasn't necessarily surprised by the 18,000 employees, but what I'm interested in is, okay, are these cuts concentrated in Paramount Plus? Are they concentrated in like the film studio part of the business? That would be my first question to start to get a sense of, is this macroeconomic? Is this a Paramount specific problem or is this a sector specific problem? And so I don't see that kind of insight here. I don't know if that insight is even publicly available yet until the affected folks find out that they're affected. But that would also potentially explain to me why there are three CEOs. I agree with you. If there are three CEOs overseeing the whole business, not great optics that three CEOs are laying off 3% of the staff. But it would make more sense to me if each one was a CEO of a division. And so
Correct.
so now if the messaging is
Or if
coming
they
from
came from a roll up, right? If they, it came
exactly.
through, hey, Paramount acquired X, and then that rolls up to Y, and if they're of a similar size across the business as well.
Exactly. So that's my first question is where are these cuts coming from inside the business? And then the second point is just I know that Paramount's preparing for a merger. And
Mhm.
so what they're doing, I'm not sure if the terms of that merger have been finalized, but the cynical view is they're making themselves more attractive pre-merger, right? You're cutting headcount, you're reducing costs, and you're making those tough decisions now so that there's no hangups in this merger process before it closes. That's like my other big picture takeaway from kind of why this news is breaking today.
I mean, it definitely can boost your share price right before you do the takeover. So that's absolutely sensible. I think that one of the key issues actually comes from a different article that I read, and I won't be dangerous enough today to try to go find it live on this call. But it was about an insight from Discovery, which, as you saw at the top, one of my first questions was like, "What's happening with Warner Brothers Discovery and Disney?" I think this is super fascinating because Disney and Netflix are thinking about the future of this kind of streaming model super differently than Discovery is. And one of the data points that was in this Discovery article, which I would imagine would be true for Paramount too, is that in Discovery's business, they offered a buffet, which is similar to the Disney buffet and the Netflix buffet, right? You subscribe to Discovery and you get all of these things. And what they actually found that customers were wanted more of and were more loyal to was not Discovery, but specific shows. And while you might have a singular show, one of the things that Netflix and Disney have done is that they've very much evolved so that it's more likely that you will actually go onto the platform to find something. Whereas what Discovery and Paramount and likely other niche players are discovering is that people are driven by wanting to watch a single show. They're actually willing to pay more for that single show. And then your job is to use that customer that you've acquired to offer them new shows, but just getting onto the platform is not something that customers are specifically interested in. So I thought that customer segmentation and that insight for the industry was incredibly interesting because if I've been pitched by a lot of businesses when somebody comes and says, I'm the Netflix of, that would actually be a really different business model than I'm the Paramount of. Even though they sound both the same, they're both streaming services. The two have very different operating models and different customer theses.
And talking about streaming specifically, that's why you're starting to see consolidation in the sector. Because one of the initial value propositions to the customer of streaming is that you could get what you wanted, when you wanted, where you wanted. And we've seen so much fragmentation in the space that I've got to go to Paramount to watch Landman, and I got to go to Netflix to watch this, and I got to go to Hulu to watch this. And like as a consumer, you just have to make a decision. Okay, like when is enough enough? And
How
so
many can I handle?
how
Yeah,
many can I
exactly.
handle here? And so, the cable bundle is starting to look attractive to some consumers again because it's like, wait, I paid one monthly price and I got everything that I wanted, right? That doesn't mean that people are going back to cable. It just means that the model is looking attractive again to the consumer of like paying one price and getting everything that I want. And I think we've reached this oversaturation point in streaming now to where like the smaller players are realizing that the only way that they can even dream of competing with Netflix is by joining forces. And so that's what you're seeing here take place. But to me, Netflix is just so far ahead of the competition in terms of mind share, in terms of market share, in terms of customer churn, in terms of the quantity of content that I don't think anyone's going to catch up. But the race is on for number two, is how I see this market.
I love it. Well, when you look at the subscriber numbers, Disney is a pretty clear number two already. I would say the race is on for number three. So, but like you said, I think one of the questions is, can a consolidated force maybe outpace Disney? Right? Because then that would be a race that's on for number two if you end up consolidating forces. It's tricky though because now the different IP has been set up. You're talking about basically a joint venture between each one of these organizations. And that's what I hypothesized would have happened 8 years ago. The fact that it didn't happen at the beginning, it's becoming increasingly challenging to leave behind the customers that you've already gotten to adopt and put them into those kinds of organizations. So the most likely way to do it is to add a fourth or a fifth CEO, Naman, and enroll one of these orgs into a joint venture that you're actually pulling the streaming divisions together into where the customers are acquired, the employees are acquired. You do some cost saving mechanisms from not having to acquire the same customer two or three times, and also from a production standpoint as well. So this is one of those businesses we've never talked about on Market Outsiders, but it certainly impacts all of us on a more than daily basis. It's kind of one of those underpinnings of our human experience right now, and I just thought it was really important to bring it up today.
One last thing I'll mention, you were talking about communication and what it says about an organization's culture. I'll just mention here, this is not the only layoff news we've heard from Paramount recently, and the article even alludes to it. Like these are further rounds, the latest round of
Correct.
layoffs. And
They talked about
so,
that in August, this August data. Mhm.
and to me, if I'm an organization, like this isn't the kind of news I want in the headlines over and over again. And so, like, if I was like on the board, if I was in like the executive seat at a place like Paramount, I'd be thinking, how do I cut the head count I need to cut once? Like, take my medicine, swallow the pill, and move on. But I think this death by a thousand cuts from a PR perspective and from a branding perspective isn't optimal. And so I think that's another lesson just for us to take away as we like think about business in general is like how do you ensure that if you have to deliver bad news, you only deliver it once, or at least you deliver it as little with as little frequency as possible. But if you're going to cut 1% of your staff here and 2% of your staff here and 3% of your staff here, and there's this drip, drip, drip effect, well, then now all of a sudden the picture of your brand to future potential employees, to customers is okay, this is a failing company. This is a company that doesn't have its act together. When like my guess is that they knew during the last round of layoffs that this next round of layoffs would have to come. So what I don't understand is why you don't just take your medicine the first time, do what you need to do, and move on. I think from like a PR and a crisis communication standpoint, that's something that I'd be thinking about too if I was forced to cut headcount.
Well, one of the things that is very common that you'll see is that kind of drastic cut followed by hiring. It is a little bit more complicated to hire in an environment where you have seen cuts, but it's much easier than doing multiple rounds of cuts because not only do you have the different rounds of cuts in the PR, but you also have the employee morale where everybody's
Hmm.
wondering when the next round of layoffs is going to come and you quiet quit inside that organization.
Hmm.
That's a really challenging piece of it. The other thing that you mentioned, Naman, that I think is insightful is that I did some of these cuts when I was at Bain. This was part of our job. Part of why we were hired actually was to come in with a fairly impartial view and to take a look at the organization and to recommend not just the types of positions that would be cut, but the actual specific names. And it was like, here's the hit list, lay them off. It was they were able to blame it on us. I haven't heard any mention in this news of them using an advisor. And I think this is one of those situations when working with a consulting advisor could really provide some shield from that and some advice on how to do it more properly. So I think you're right about that. This does seem like it doesn't seem like anything has evolved sector wide in the past 6 to 8 months that would have changed the economics if they decided in August that the 15% was going to be there, then like call it at that point, right? Let everybody know what's going to be happening. Um, I think you see different pieces of that in other markets where you have just true uncertainty. This is uncertainty inspired by lack of decision making. You see uncertainty in other markets based on macroeconomic principles, based on competitive pressures, based on AI disruption. That's not what we're seeing here. And I think that's really telling. I think it'd be fun to do a showdown of some of the key media companies at some point in the future and to really dive into like how does Paramount make its money. If you want some next steps out of the session today, go figure it out. Like Naman said, I think there's a couple of divisions. Why do they have three CEOs? A lot of our pod is not just focused on answers, but on bringing up the right questions, the insightful questions that build your business acumen and help you connect the dots. Once you've done that research, feel free to ping us with your questions and your insights, as well as the names of other companies and sectors that you'd like future information on. Thanks so much for joining us today on the pod. Loved being with you. We'll see you tomorrow.